This is tape 1 of Survivors of the Shoah interview with Jack Gross, Yaakov Gross. The interviewer is David Brodsky. The interview is taking place on November 9th, 1997 in Englewood, New Jersey, in the United States of America, and the language of the interview is English. Hi, I'm David Brodsky, and today I'm interviewing Jacob Gross. The interview is taking place on November 9th, 1997 in Englewood, New Jersey, in the United States of America, and the language of the interview is English. Can you tell us your name?
Jack Gross.
How do you spell that?
G-R-O-S-S.
What was your name at birth?
Name of birth was Jacob Gross, and it was spelled a little differently, G-R-O-S-Z.
What was your Hebrew name?
Hebrew name is Yisrael Yaakov Yoikel Gross.
Did you have any nicknames?
Yeah, they call me by the name of Yoikel, the last of the three names.
Any other names ever?
No, not that I'm aware of, no.
Any fake names?
Well, during the war I had a fake name, yes. But other than that...
What was that?
Well, during the time of the deportation, when I escaped from the ghetto, I assumed I took on I took papers from a friend, a Christian boy, whose name was Donnie Kozma.
How do you spell that?
D-A-N-Y, and Kozma, K-O-Z-M-A.
When were you born?
I was born in Tasnad, Romania.
How do you spell that?
T-A-S-N-A-D, Romania.
Where's that near?
That's in the area near Satomari, not far from Satomari, in the same general area.
And what date were you born?
August 6, 1930.
How old are you today?
Today I'm 67.
What do you remember about your father?
Well, I remember my father as a tall young man with a black beard. He was a very learned man. He was a rabbi by accomplishment, and he was also a merchant by profession. Unfortunately, I don't remember too much about him because he died when he was young and I was very young. Matter of fact, he died on my birthday. And he died when he was only 36 years old, in 1939.
What was his name?
His name was, in Hebrew, was Yechiel Nissen, and in Romanian or Hungarian, they called him Mihai, or Michael.
What type of work did he do?
Well, he was, at one time, these things are told to me later on, because as a child I don't really remember too much, but I do know that he was in the wine, I was told he was in the wine business in the beginning, and then he later on was in the grocery business, retail grocery, and then he was also teaching young men in the higher education, the Hebrew education.
What was your mother's name?
My mother's name was Rose, or in Hebrew, Reitze, or Yiddish, Reitze. And she was a housewife until my father died. She was a mother of 7 children. After my father died, she assumed the role of breadwinner, and she went into a different business, and she succeeded very well.
What was her maiden name?
Her maiden name was, she was born Teidelbaum.
What type of work did she do after your father passed away?
Well, after my father passed away, she was dealing in textiles and dry goods in a wholesale level, buying from Budapest and bringing it down to our community in Satmar. In those days, Jews did not have a license to start new businesses. Those who had licenses could continue, but they couldn't start any new. So that forced her to go into partnership with a Christian woman. It worked out pretty well, as far as I know. However, and this is the very same woman who offered her children's papers for us to escape, and it is her son's paper that I finally had. This woman also offered us papers of her daughter, and she happened to be the same age as my older sister. But unfortunately, my sister refused. She wanted to go with her mother.
What was her name?
My sister's name?
The woman's name?
The woman's name. Her last name was Cosma, but I don't remember her first name. I don't remember that.
Do you remember much about her?
Yeah, I remember she was a very decent Christian woman. She was honest because the whole business was left in her hands. She was managing. My mother was mostly in Budapest on buying trips most of the time. The business was a retail business, and I remember clearly that on market days, which in Europe, in those days they had a one day set aside for marketing, which was the farmers used to come in from all the surrounding areas to bring their produce. And those days were very, very busy, hectic days. I remember just when I used to go in, the place was packed with people. So it was a pretty good business to start with. And that's how we sustained ourselves and managed to survive.
Did many women work outside the house then?
Many women, no, that was not the norm in those days, no. In fact, my mother was very exceptional in this respect, that coming from a background that she came from and not having had experience in working and dealing with people in general, being just a housewife, and transformed herself to a businesswoman. And then I was later told later on, and people who had dealings with her, who survived after the war, that she was indeed a very smart, intelligent woman. She was, knew what her business very well.
What were your brothers and sisters' names?
Well, my oldest sister, I was the second child. My oldest sister was Handy. My brothers, I had three brothers. One was Raphael, Zalmalai, and Shmuel. Then I had three other sisters, younger than me. Sorry, two other sisters, younger than me. Baila and Reza Blima. They're all younger than me.
How did you all get along?
Well, I think we got along, but I must say this, though, that when my father died, they sent me away right away, so I really was not home that much after the age of 10. For the first year, I was home because I had to say Kaddish, and my mother, Leah Shalom, was very, 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 very insistent that we come every morning. In the coldest winter days, they woke us up, the three little boys went to say Kaddish. So after that year was over, then I was sent away to a grandfather, to an uncle. I was most of the time away. Reason, I suppose, in these days was both economic and probably also for guidance, that a boy should have a male guide to show him, teach him and so on. So they sent me to uncles and grandfathers. So I did not spend much time at home. To answer your question about how they got along, I think we got along very well, but then again, I wasn't home much.
What type of religious upbringing did you have?
Very religious upbringing. My family comes from Hasidic background, not only Hasidic, but a rabbinic background. Religion was, we lived religion. It wasn't that we were taught religion, but this was part of life. Many things we did was by rote. We just didn't know why we did them because we were just brought up that way. There was no two ways about it, no other way. So yes, it was very, very religious home.
What the rabbis are in your background?
Yes, rabbis are in background from both my father's and from maternal and paternal side. My father's family originally comes from Poland. I'm told that the immediate family was not rabbinic, but my father's father was definitely a rabbi. He had 7 sons. All 7 were rabbis, all with positions in various places in Hungary, Romania. From my mother's side, she's a Teitelbaum, and she comes from the famous Teitelbaum family, which dynasty was started in Sighet, and it was a 200-year-old, 220-year-old dynasty, and from that family came many famous rabbis, and the latest one being the Satmar Rebbe. And so we are my mother's family, or my mother's ancestors, is a branch of that family. So basically, all the Teitelbaums are cousins, perhaps distant cousins, but cousins. That's the family we come from. My mother's father and grandfather were rabbis of communities in the Carpathian Mountains.
Where?
Volava. It's called Volava. Now, Volava was not a big city, but it had a large area, region, and a rabbi there was comprising of many little villages. So he had sort of a rabbi of a region, not just a little town.
What was his name?
His name, well, my great-grandfather was Yisroel Yaakov Teitelbaum, the way I'm named after, and my grandfather's name was Aaron Teitelbaum. That area, the Carpathian Mountains, Hungarians occupied that part of the country early in 1940. And because they found the area to be vulnerable, being near the border, they have deported the Jews as early as 1942 already. Therefore, my grandfather in 1942 had to leave that town, and he came to Hungary, near Bátor, Hungary, where he became the rabbi there. He actually occupied the position of his brother who deceased him before. And so for the last 2.5 years, he was a rabbi of near Bátor.
What was his brother's name?
His brother's name was Naftuli Teitelbaum. He was a well-known man in Hungary.
Do you remember your grandfather much?
Indeed, I remember very well because, as I mentioned before, after my father died, I was sent away, and I spent, among other places, in my grandfather's house quite a while. In fact, I had my mitzvah there. That's why I got my mitzvah in my grandfather's house. He was like a father to me.
So were you raised as a Satmar Hasidic?
Well, they were not raised as Satmar because Satmar is just a branch of this dynasty. So they were rabbis in their own right, so they didn't follow any of the thing. But it is part of the Teitelbaum family, and they are all Hasidim. They were not considered Satmar. Satmar is a later, an offspring, an offshoot of the Teitelbaum dynasty, which was really Sighet. It really started in Sighet. And that's what they used to call him, Sighet. Now, Satmar came about in the mid-30s when he became Rav in Satmar. So perhaps he's better known for Satmar, but really in those days, Satmar did not exist as an entity.
Were there all the different distinctions like there is in the present day back in Hungary in those days before the war?
Distinctions as to
religious, between different Hasidic groups?
Yes, not as much as you would know here in America, because I said before, people just were born into families, Hasidic families, didn't know which Hasidim they belonged to, which Hasidim. It's a way of life. It was a way of life. You didn't have to follow a particular Rebbe. Some had preferences for one or the other, but most of them were just unaffiliated. And they had either because of proximity or because of familiarity that they favored one to another, but they were not particularly designated as one or the other.
Do you remember what Shabbos was like at home?
Oh, Shabbos was the best day of the year, of the week, of course. First of all, we had to eat more than we had during the week. Food in those days was not only because of poverty, but also because of availability. You just couldn't get all the food one wanted, even if you had the money. So Shabbos was always a day of joy. As children, if I remember, we were getting meat and getting goodies and cookies. So yes, that was the best day of the week for sure. You didn't have to go to school. There was cheder, which was a very onerous, very burdensome thing. Since we talk about why Shabbos was better, the weekdays was very, very hectic. We had to, we used to get up, we used to start school 7 in the morning and finish maybe 8 o'clock at night and continue schooling all day, maybe a break here and there for half hour.
What did you do first in your daily routine?
Well, first in daily routine, we went to cheder in the morning, learned for about an hour and a half, from 7 to about 8:30. We given breakfast. Then we had to go to public school, 9 o'clock. Public school lasted till about 2:30, 3 o'clock. Back to cheder. That's when we had to catch up on all the hours we missed during the day. So we're back to late in the evening. So it was difficult. Therefore, Shabbos was a very good day.
Do you remember any of the rabbis you had for cheder?
No, fortunately, I can't remember that. No.
Or any of the kids
I
that
had
were with
many,
you?
so none of them stand out as being so distinct.
Any of the children that you were together with? No.
Not really, no.
Any of your friends?
From cheder?
Or from before the war?
No, because again, I was not in one place for too long. I was away, and I was, besides my grandfather, I was at my uncle's place, and I came back to South May. It was really, I wasn't really too long in one place. I couldn't make some permanent friendships. Or.
When you started school, where were you going to school at?
When I started school, you mean elementary school? Well, I started school in public school in Romania. Actually, it was Romania at that time. And so I did first 3 classes in Romanian. Although Hungarian was spoken in our area because the area is ethnic Hungarian. It was before the war Hungarian, during the war Hungarian, it was many times Hungarian, it goes back and forth. One of these areas in Balkan countries where it changed hands depending whoever was in power in the big countries, in the bigger countries. Now, so therefore I know Hungarian better than Romanian. In fact, I don't remember anything Romanian because Romanian was not spoken in the street or at home. It was just strictly in the school.
Where was the school, elementary school located?
I can't remember that.
What town?
Oh, in Satmar, yeah. Yeah.
And what age did you start there?
I think I started at 7. In those days, we started at 7. Yeah.
In cheder?
Cheder started at 3. Cheder in those days, there was upsharing. You know what upsharing is? Where you cut off the hair, the long hair, and you leave the payas. Just leave payas. You cut off the hair. Until then, you don't cut the hair at all. And that's the first cutting, and then at that time, you were already taken to cheder. Yeah.
Do you remember your upshearing?
No, I don't remember that, but I do remember the first day of cheder. That I remember. Why do I remember that? Because I remember just to throw candies on my head to make us want to go to cheder. There was an enticement with candies and stuff. So, but that was the system. I wasn't the exception. That was everybody.
Were there many non-Jews in class with you in public school?
Yeah, public school was mainly non-Jews. In fact, public school in those days were were actually not religious schools per se, but there is no separation church and state in those countries. So therefore, it was mandatory to learn religion, and the dominant religion was Catholicism. So they had, we were excused, the Jews were excused those hours of classes. but it was mandatory on a weekly basis where a priest or a nun used to come in and teach this class. So it was a public school, and I would say 95% were Christian, not Jews.
What was your town like?
In what sense? Well, I mean, in size or well, Satmar was a medium-sized city of about, I think today it's about 50,000, 60,000. It's a nice little city. It's not a shtetl. It's a city. It's a real city. It was mostly agriculture. Lived in agriculture in the surrounding areas. It had some industry, light industry. Jews were very much involved in that. In fact, there was a famous textile factory owned by a famous family called Freund, the Freund family. Their descendants are still around today. In fact, I just met recently somebody from grandchildren from that family. They were intelligent enough, that Freund family was smart enough that in 1938-39, they emigrated to Palestine. Didn't give up the business. They left it to some children, some relatives, but the founders, the older generation, left. Anyway, of that community, about 13,000 were Jews. There was naturally a lot of poverty. There were some people who had no trades. Many of them were hardworking people, making a living from agriculture, meaning that they were acting as middlemen from the farmer to the marketplace. They were bringing in milk and produce and stuff. Others were involved in commerce, retail business rather, retail. The whole central square of Satmar was all Jewish stores, and on Shabbos was dead. The stores were, the central square was quiet, was no business. So it was very much controlled by Jews, the retail business was. And others were involved in currency trading. At least in those days, during the wartime, the currency fluctuated very badly from one country to another. So there was a big business traveling back and forth and dealing in currency. And some people did very well. There were some very rich people there, and others not so well. But it was a mixed community. It consisted of very religious, not so religious, and hardly any secular people. I mean, everybody was religious, but the only difference was in the degree of religion. They had one big shul, which still stands today. I was there not long ago. They keep it as a memorial, it's not used anymore. Which many of the people belonged to. That was the non-aligned or independent synagogue of Satmar. And then there was the Hasidic synagogue, the Satmar Rebbe, who had a great following. And a lot of people belonged to his synagogue. So there was two kinds. We got along well, got along very well. The Satmar Rebbe, who was actually also the Rav of the town, in addition to being the Rebbe of Hasid, he was giving his yearly obligatory speech, or twice a year perhaps. He went there. That was the main event of the year. Everybody followed him there. It was packed to the rafters. And I remember only one thing, that when he was there, he was doing mostly Musar. That's what I mean. They were not religious enough for his. So in this sense, he didn't please everybody. He had a lot of opposition there in Satmar himself.
How would people express their opposition?
By not coming to his shul, by keeping strictly separate their own. Everything else was controlled by him. I mean, the shechita and the mikvahs, all the religious paraphernalia was all under his control, but they were just not giving him the due respect, so to speak. For instance, I remember one speech he said that in that general synagogue, the main synagogue, he was saying that in my synagogue I will tell women not to wear a sheitel. That's not good enough. For you, all I'm asking you, please wear a sheitel. Don't go with your hair. So he made some concessions, but it didn't go too well anyways. He was too much for his community.
Did many women cover their hair in those days?
Yeah, in general, yes. Sutton was very, I mean, he had a tremendous influence on that community. Yes.
What shul did you go to?
My family belonged to his shul. In fact, we lived on the same street, so it was just a block away.
What was your address before the war?
24 Joseph Herzog Street.
What was your place like, where you lived?
Well, where we lived was a very small house. It was like sort of a courtyard. The system was there that they built houses around the courtyard, and several families had entrances their own. It was sort of, I can explain how comparing to today's housing. It's like a condominium like today, in a very old-fashioned way, where you shared one entrance to a courtyard, and everybody had their own entrance there. And of course, there was no plumbing, so there was outhouses. That was the only way, and that too was shared. So it wasn't. I can't say it was a pleasant living, even though Sutton was a city, but it was backward. It didn't have the plumbing of that we know it today. Although after the war they did canalize the city and all that. We did have electricity, but I remember way back when I was a child, we didn't have electricity either. We still had oil-burning lamps. And especially in Cheder, we didn't have this. We had to go on like candles and strain ourselves to read and so at night, the long winter nights. So I don't have a pleasant memory as far as physical amenities and so on. We did not have a very good life there. It was a hard life.
Did you ever have any non-Jewish friends?
No. There's one thing about life in Satmar and perhaps in most other communities. Jews are very, very separated, very unto themselves. Either because of their dress and their garb and their way of life, or because it was taught to us that Christians only mean to harm us, so the least you do have dealings with them, the better. Of course, business people dealt with, in the everyday life, dealt with Christians, but on a social level, not at all. As a boy, as a child, even in school, when we had to go out and play outside on the recess and so on, we kept to ourselves. We had very little to do with the Christian boys.
Did you ever experience any anti-Semitism personally?
Oh yes, a lot. For instance, of course I had pay, so I was recognizable that I was a Jew. And when I walked on the sidewalk, for instance, in my city, and a bunch of kids came along, we automatically knew we had to get off the sidewalk, because if you stay on the sidewalk, they're going to do something to you. Either they're going to kick you, or spit at you, or push you, or something. So there's definitely anti-Semitism, not only in spirit, but also in action, constantly. As children, we experience it all the time.
Would they say anything to you?
Yeah, dirty Jew, that was the common phrase, or Jew, why don't you go to Palestine?
We're at the end of tape 1. This is tape 2 of Survivors of the Shoah interview with Jack Gross, November 9th, 1997. What would you feel like when they would call you names?
Very resentful, very bitter, and I was asking myself, why don't you go to Palestine? What are we doing there? And of course, those thoughts and those kind of questions were forbidden in our circles because and this is something that I want to make clear, whoever listens, that in the Eastern Europe majority and vast majority of people were anti-Zionist, very anti-Zionist. Simply the reason because the groups that captured, so to speak, or now I would say the word captured, but somehow by necessity, were the Zionists, were not religious. There was the Shomer Tza'ir and other and socialist-minded people who, by their ideology, rejected religion altogether, and tried to inject this kind of thought to our young people. So our leaders, our rabbis and teachers were very much against Zionism and about the thought of going to Israel, to Palestine in those days. Of course, the other reason was that they were so fervently believers in the Messiah that they would not think of anyone taking the matters in their own hand and do something that is only through God's hand that will be shown a sign or something like that. That belief was very, 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 very strong. I mean, even as a child, I believe there's no other way to go to Palestine except the Messiah will lead us on a white horse. Now, for that reason, this kind of thinking of saying that let's go to Palestine was really relegated to very few, and there were some young men who were belonging to some of these, but it was all done in clandestiny, not openly. And therefore, we really were trapped. I mean, our existence as a child, as I remember, was sort of hopeless. We saw that the anti-Semitism was rising, and there was no way out. There was nowhere to go. So yes, my feeling was very bitter and very pessimistic.
How did people react to people who went to Palestine?
Well, there was exception. They didn't react because there were very, very few who went. Those who went were the few young ones, and they were considered, they were just exceptions, the few rebels. So they looked upon as the rebels, not the mainstream for sure. And the others who went, and there are also very few, were very rich people who could buy their way into, well, so it was a sort of a luxury trip. I mean, everybody's Jew was to eventually end up in Eretz Yisrael. But as a child, it was taught to us, we're all going to end up there through Messiah, we're going to, Tchias HaMesim and all that, and resurrection and all that. But so whoever could afford to go there and to die there, that was the greatest hope to do, but not to be involved to build a country, just to die there so that the resurrection would be easier. But that was basically the way we were taught as a child. So there weren't many to look at who went to Palestine at the time to say whether it's right or wrong.
Did you know anybody who went before the war?
I knew some young men who went. And I also knew this family I mentioned before. There was a rich family who, for some reason, decided, even though they were still active in business and they were doing very well, and at that time anti-Semitism was not so great yet, Jews could still function. But they had the foresight, I guess, or because they were rich enough, they afforded the luxury to go in their older age to go and settle in Palestine.
Remember this fellow's name who went? Or the family?
The family was the Freund family. From Southern.
Do you remember some of the Jewish holidays?
Of course, I remember all the Jewish holidays.
What was that like in your town?
Well, it was a time when the preparations and the days and the weeks before meant so much to all of us. It certainly was the days of awe and expectation. It was really living the holidays. It wasn't just going through a date in the calendar. It was really the before and the after. Everything, a lot of life, a lot of social life centers around the holidays. Families getting together, trying our very best to have the best clothes and the best food and putting the best foot forward. It was like a Shabbos, but 10 times bigger. So holidays meant a lot to us. Besides that, in Satmar, being that this was the town, the center for the Satmar, for the Hasidim, for the Satmar Hasidim, we had a lot of influx of a lot of people from out of town. So you met a lot of people, and the streets were full of people. I mean, there was life. There was a lot of activity. Excuse me. The community, our community, there's a Satmar community there, the city community, doubled in size. Towns and townspeople came from all over.
Did you ever have any personal dealings with the Satmar Rebbe before the war?
Before the war, no. As a child, I had very little personal dealings. But I did have a lot of dealings with him later on.
We'll talk about that. Do you remember when your father was sick?
Yes, I do remember my father was sick. It came very suddenly. My father was otherwise a healthy man. He came home one day from shul, pale and drawn, and we said, what happened? Oh, he says, oh, I just slipped in the mikveh, that's all. But the truth of the matter is that they poured water on him because he fainted. They put cold water on him. I guess that's the only way they know how to revive it those days. Anyway, upon examination, it was discovered that he had bursted appendicitis, bad appendicitis. Took him to the hospital. They operated immediately, but the area around it was infected already, and they didn't have any antibiotics those days, so they had only a crude method of putting pipes to drain off the pus. That didn't help, unfortunately. Spread to the heart, and it wasn't more than 4 days or 5 days that he died from something that today would be very avoidable. And what I remember, of course, is that in my shul there, Shabbos, he died on a Sunday morning. On Shabbos afternoon, they said Tillim, and I was very disturbed. Why are they saying Tillim? They said, it's your father, and that was really shocked. They didn't tell us as children that it was so bad, that he was in such a bad state. So naturally, I was very shocked. And early 4 o'clock in the morning, they woke us up. They woke me up, particularly, that he said he wants to see me. I was his second oldest boy, so to speak. And he wanted to see me, and he knew that it was my birthday. He was conscious the last minute. 4 in the morning, he took me to his bedside. He couldn't talk anymore, but motioned me to come close to him. And all he said to me that I should just listen to my mother. I should just follow whatever my mother says. And 2 hours later, he died. People today still tell me that this was the biggest funeral they ever remember in Satmar. A, because he was a very young man, he was 36, and it was so sudden. And he was the father of 7 children. And the other reason is they say that he was a very respected man. And it was unusual for a man of that young age to make a name for himself. He was a quiet man, he was a very learned man, and I guess it was a big shock to everybody. So people still remember that funeral, which is 1939.
Do you remember the funeral?
Yes. Yes. Of course, I had to say Kaddish. My 3 little brothers. In those days, unlike today, you lose the head of the family. It was a big tragedy. Big tragedy. Because there was no Social Security. There was no anything. There's no savings. You know, you just made do from day to day. You're lucky if you made it to day to day. And if a family of 7 children, a head of family of 7 children passed away, it was a big tragedy. Yeah. But thank God we survived. My mother was a very capable woman, and she managed.
Did the community help out?
I think they did. I'm not sure. I think I did. They did. Yeah.
And then what happened?
Well, what happened, I was sent away, as I said before. I was sent first to my uncle's place.
Where?
In a city called Krula, not Karoly, Hungarian.
Where was that near?
That was near Satmar. It was about 30 miles from Satmar. And excuse me a second. I was there for about a year.
What were you doing?
I was there. I was only 11 years old, and I was very independent. I had my own room, and stupidly enough, I imitated all the older boys. I went to mikveh every morning. That was the thing to do in those days. The yeshiva bochum, the bigger boys, went to mikveh every morning before davening. I imitated them. I didn't do the proper protection. I almost died. I had a cold and I had an ear infection. I almost died. I was near death. Anyway, so they brought me back. Of course, I got healthy, and I was there for a year. And then I came home. Usually, holidays, the zmanim were from holidays to holidays, from after Shoah to Pesach, from after Pesach to Rosh Hashanah again. So, for holidays, for a month, I used to come home, back to Satmar. And then he sent me away to near Batra to my grandfather.
Before that, what was your uncle's name?
My uncle's name was Shmuel Gross. He's a big rabbi, and he was the Rav in that community. He has survivors. He has children here in America.
Did people treat you differently because of the rabbinic background
Yeah,
that you had?
yeah. Well, I was given I was privileged. I was sitting. I had a table. I was privileged. I was somebody because of my connections. I mean, my family connections. Yeah, he was my uncle. And he was the head of a big yeshiva there. It was at that time it was considered big, 150 boys.
What was it called?
Krula Yeshiva, Krula. There are people here in New York who still remember, who were there.
What was the yeshiva like compared to Cheder?
Well, it was tougher because we had to keep up with a older curriculum. It was very tough. But my uncle gave me a lot of leeway. He never failed in anything. He used to have tests every week. It was very nice. He used to say, next week you'll try, you'll do better next week. But never say that you're not good, or never gave me a failing mark. I kept up. I was a pretty good student. I was not a very good student in the sense that I didn't study well. I didn't have patience for Gemara. I loved it, but I didn't have patience for the long drawn out. Perhaps the many hours of studying was really what really did it. It was too much for a young boy, till 8, 9 o'clock at night. And they always said to me, he has the capacity, he only has the willpower to do it. But I don't think I did so well. I think I did better in my learning, and whatever I know today is from what I did after the war, which we'll get to later on in Lugano, which I was very lucky to be associated with some very good people there.
Did you have much contact with your family when you were by your uncle?
Just letters occasionally, yeah. Yeah, no, not much, no. Just to write a letter every month or so. I was really on my own at 11, which really helped me in a sense later on to be so independent when the bad times came and I could make decisions and take care of myself, my own, which was really a good preparation for that.
Then what happened?
Well, then this went on for about 3 years until finally I was bar mitzvah in near Batra, my grandfather's place.
Well, how was near Batra compared to your uncle's?
Much better because first I lived in his, excuse me, in my grandfather's house. I was part of the family there. And I was privileged. I was always the Ro's grandson. I was a good-looking boy with nice pants, and I stood out. So I had certain privileges. People still remember that, still remember me. They still tease me about my past. I was a good-looking boy. Anyway.
How big, who was in the family? What you were living in the house with?
Well, who was the family? At that time, they were all married except the one daughter, the youngest daughter, who is now the Satmar Rebbetzin, who is now married to the present Satmar Rav.
What's her name?
Pesalaya. She's 7 years older than me, so she was not that far older, and so we got along very well. She was like my sister. And we had a very close relationship ever since. You know, we're still very close today, to this day. It's very, very close.
So that's on your father's side?
No, that's my mother's side. She's my mother's side. She was a title mom. Yeah. Mother's father. She's my mother's younger sister. My mother was the oldest, so there was a big age difference between my mother and her. She's the youngest. So so there I stayed, and then for some reason, I don't know why, they sent me back home. And this was 1944, when, of course, 1944, March 19, a famous date in Hungarian Jewish history, when the Germans marched into Hungary. Actually, Hungary was an ally of Germany, and this is why the Germans were not there during all this time. The reason they marched into Hungary was because the front, the Russian front, the war was getting closer to the Hungarian region. So they sent in their stormtroopers and their occupation forces, so to speak.
Before the Germans came, what did you heard of the events going around in the world?
Well, officially we heard nothing. But what we did hear, and it was an interesting thing, and I'm glad you asked me this question, because what happened in Poland, of course, we all know, it preceded the Hungarian tragedy. And some of the youngsters, very few, managed to escape to Hungary and lived under assumed names, under Christian names, even though they didn't speak Hungarian. And to this day, I don't know how they got away with it, how they managed it. But they were excellent in subterfuge and in hiding. These young boys depended on the communities for food. They had no jobs, and for money. And of course, like all families, our family too, our household too, were sent. These boys came to us. Sometimes they knocked on the door, wanted a supper or something to eat. And we befriended them, talked to them. And they told us horrible stories. I mean, they told us the facts of life. Well, they told us, for instance, that about the gas chambers. They told us about people not coming back ever. That once you go into a ghetto, that it starts. They told us, for instance, that the beginning is a softer treatment by taking you in, letting you take suitcases, making you believe that you're going to live a normal life. And then they take everything away. They strip you, and then they take you to concentration camp, and then they kill you. They told you everything. Now, these were young boys, and some of them dismissed them as a little tamished, a little mixed up. Okay, that they went through so much hardship that they're making up these stories. They're talking of illusions. They have illusions of horror. So. But I was very observant, and I listened to these boys, and I made friends with these boys. They came, they ate, they sat around, they had nothing to do. They were glad they had a house where to stay. So they stayed on and talked and talked. And when I heard these stories, and they told us, run if you can, because you see, this was the time when the Germans came in, and they started to introduce laws that were much stricter than the Hungarians did. You couldn't go take a train, you couldn't travel on a train anymore, Jews couldn't travel. There are many things that was the normal, everyday thing Jews couldn't do. And they recognized this is the beginning of a trap, that they want to entrap people, keep them all in their places so they can get them all together. And they told us, these are the signs. And they told us, run, save yourself. They used to say in Yiddish, ratet. People didn't listen. And to counter their claim, and this is really the crux of the matter, I want to really make a point of this, that the Jewish leadership in Budapest, the Judenrat, that's another thing that the Germans did as soon as they came in, they appointed a Judenrat. Meaning that they appointed people, they pushed aside people who were the older and established people, and they set in people that they thought, and they actually succeeded in working with, younger people, adventurers, people who wanted to get careers, who were nobodies before, and these are usually the people that the Germans seeked out in these countries where they occupied. The ones who were really not the mainstream, not from the establishment. And anyways, they established this Judenrat from these nobodies who were not anybody before. And these people sent out notices to communities, letters, and I saw it myself. I mean, it's posted in the synagogue, that there will be ghettos indeed, but they will take them to Hungarian open farmland where they'll work on the farms. It was in the spring, and they needed laborers in the farmland because the soldiers were away in the front. They needed workers, field workers, agricultural workers. And that will stay there, and the families will stay together, sit tight. Now, these were placards that were sent all over. Plus, in a Jewish publication, they had a small Jewish publication that was printed in Budapest. They repeated this canard, this story. Now, you know, when you hear on one side your own leaders tell you don't run, and then you have a couple of refugees, a couple of young, they were all young boys, they may be 17, 18, 19-year boys, because they're the only ones who could run away and go through the hardships they had to go through to get to all the way to Hungary. And when they tell you stories of this, so who do you believe? Most people believe the establishment, of course. So people didn't do anything. I, on the other hand, somehow, why I don't know, but I can't explain it to this day, listened to these boys. And I saw, and they told us all the time, these are the signs, this is exactly how it started in our place. Our leaders also betrayed us. They told us that the leaders of the ghetto in their own communities, Lodz and Warsaw and all these places, told them stories that don't resist. If you resist, you're going to be shot. If you do, you'll live, and all that stuff. That it's a repeat, and I listened to them. And so,
do you remember the names of any of the boys?
No, I don't remember the names. I do remember their faces, though, but I don't remember their names. I don't remember their names.
What language would you speak to them in?
Yiddish. These boys spoke Yiddish and Polish. And as I said before, I don't know to this day how they could exist as they lived as Christians without the language. But I don't know what happened to them at the end. Of course, we lost contact with them after.
Before the Germans, were there any other effects of the war that you saw?
Yes, of course. There were shortages of everything. There were restrictions. Jews were restricted already. One of the reasons the Germans would not occupy Hungary, because Hungary was an ally of Germany, so Hungary introduced their anti-Jewish laws on their own without the German prodding. And so, yes, there were very, very strict anti-Jewish laws. I can't tell you. Well, for instance, you couldn't have a Jew could not be in any university, could not have any license to practice any profession. Those who were already practicing could continue, but no new licensees. The restrictions were tremendous. And of course, the overt anti-Semitism is continuous, name-calling, and lately it went as far as at night used to throw stone in the windows, the glass windows. We used to board up our windows with plywood because things were so bad. Okay, it was. I mean, anti-Semitism without the Germans was also tremendous, but it was not a life and death thing. It was just a daily harassment and difficulty.
Before the Germans came, were people still getting married and children being born?
Yes. Life went on in their own way. Yes.
And were you able to get things like matzah?
Oh yes. In our own community, we had enough freedom to do all these things. Yes.
Lulav.
Yes.
What about the men in the community?
Well, the men in the community actually, every able-bodied man had to join the army. Now, the Hungarians did not trust the Jews to be in the army, so they created their own, what's called Munkataba, which meant labor camps, okay? And they were basically working behind the soldiers doing the dirty work, digging ditches, cleaning latrines, and all kinds of stuff that they needed for the army, but they were never in the front. And so these men, anybody from I think 20 to 48, had to join. And so many of the men who perhaps survived today, who are still around today, from Hungary, are perhaps from that camp, because those people were not killed. They were starved to death in the end. But some of them survived. In other words, there wasn't a systematic killing process as it would be with the women and children or the older people. Able-bodied men were usually in the army, called the labor camp. It was sort of a semi, it wasn't an army.
Did everybody go?
Everybody did not go. You tried to get out of it. So a lot of people hid. A lot of people faked it by pretending to be sick. Some people maimed themselves to get out of it. Because what they did in the end, I mean, they knew that it was, first of all, it was very tough, very harsh. But what they did also, when the Jews were too close to the front, they exposed them to the enemy. So they were killed. Many of them were killed, crossfire and whatnot. So, and also in that starvation, there was, the food was not adequate, so people came back sick and so on. Although a lot of people did survive. So yes, people did try to get away and not going, but they were not successful. Not many were successful.
Were you able to travel much in those days before the Germans came?
We were able to travel. But we had to have identity papers. Everybody had to have identity. Trains were constantly checked by police, constantly. And as a young boy, I had the proper papers, so I didn't have any problems. I used to travel. But I was told that people who had questionable papers, such as people who came, a lot of people in Hungary came from other countries, like Poland. In the First World War, they ran away and they stayed on. And they were really not Hungarians. So they had some kind of papers, but they were not really citizens of Hungary. Those people were in trouble. They used to take them off trains and all kinds of, and deport them. Yeah.
Did you ever talk about the situation with your grandfather?
Did I talk about the situation? I don't remember if I talked about it. I mean, we all knew what's happening. No, I don't remember if I talked about it. No.
What were people who moved before the Germans came?
The people who moved were pessimistic, but not despondent, because the things that happened in Poland did not happen in Hungary. So we had hope, and of course the war, we knew that the Germans are going to lose. I mean, the tide has turned already. 1943, 44, it was just a matter of time. We were hoping that we were going to ride it out. But of course the Germans had different plans, and the Germans had little time to do what they went to do, so they went to extraordinary lengths to confuse us, to mislead us, so that we should cooperate.
We're at the end of tape 2. Survivors of the Shoah interview with Jack Gross, November 9th, 1997. Do you remember when the Germans when you first heard the Germans were coming?
Yeah. It was a Sunday, I think it was March 19. It was indeed a gloomy day because the whole community was very, very upset when they heard that. The impression I got was that it's sort of the beginning of the end.
Where were you at this time?
I was at that time, I was in Satmar, I was at home, and the news I happened to hear in the synagogue. I was in the synagogue, and there the news spread like wildfire. Everybody told the next one, quiet, you hear. Anyway, they heard, and everybody heard, and it was shocking, it was terrible. We, as I said before, we lived in the illusion that things would not happen to us, but then I realized that it's not so. So things started to change immediately. For instance, in my own personal experience, we didn't go to Cheder anymore for some reason. I don't know why, but we didn't go to school. The whole routine of life changed suddenly. That year, I think Pesach came early. I think it came at the beginning of April. And we were in the midst of preparing for Pesach, and I remember clearly that like it was the custom every year to have a new suit or a new something for Pesach. And I had to go to a tailor those days you didn't buy ready-made clothes, everything was made by a tailor. So anyway, I went to go to a tailor to have a custom to. And I made a remark to my mother, says, what's the use? Why do I need a suit for? It's, you know, the situation was so pessimistic, so terrible. I mean, a gloom and doom settled down on everybody at that time.
What did your mother say?
Well, like all mothers, trying to encourage. And yeah, I went through and made the suit. I never wore the suit. Anyways, then of course, everybody was in the impression that, as I said before, that this is not going to last long. They take us only for a short time. However, we're going to vacate the houses, so we got to take all those valuables and bury them. So we all went to bury our valuables. I remember I myself dug holes in the backyard, put away the silver, put away the precious books that my father left, the big library and all that. Anyways, so that's what we got busy ourselves with.
When was this?
This was just about before Pesach, I would say from March to April.
Had the Germans come yet?
The Germans were in, yeah, they were in already. Now, they didn't come as far as Satmar. They came in first to Budapest and other major cities. Satmar was not considered a big major city. But we saw signs, we saw them already on the streets, you know, here and there. You could see, so before never saw a German soldier.
What was your reaction when you first saw a German soldier?
It was terror. I mean, it was just to see them, you know, was I mean, if you ever saw a German uniform, I mean, with their boots and all that, it was quite awful, and especially after the stories you hear.
Was there more anti-Semitism that you started to see personally?
Oh yeah. The anti-Semitism started. Well, what happened right after that? They started to make raids on Jews, meaning that wherever Jews gathered, synagogues or any place where Jews get together, used to surround the place and look for papers. Now there were times when Jews didn't have papers; they came from home to Daub. They used to arrest them left and right, take them into police stations. Eventually, they released them when they finally proved who they are, where they live. But the harassment was tremendous. This constant arrest, the constant raids and arrests and release and raids and arrests. This just went on.
Were you in places that they raided?
Yes, I was once in a place they raided.
Where?
In fact, I was either in a cheder or in a synagogue. I remember in a place, a public place, where they took us into the police station. And they treated us, we're children, Boston children, and maybe a few older boys, but anyway, they treated us like criminals, put us down in the basement, and started interrogating us.
In what language?
Hungarian. Just, by the way, the harsh treatment, all that was done by Hungarian police. They were not done by Germans. The Germans were just giving the orders. I remember too that the Germans did not have many people there. They didn't have the manpower anymore to do what they wanted to do. So they needed not only the full cooperation of the Jews, but they needed the Hungarian government's full cooperation. And they got it. The Hungarian police were just as vicious, or even more so than the Germans. So they did the interrogation. And besides, they knew the language, so naturally they can do the contact with the public, with the people. So to answer your question, it was done in Hungarian. And they kept us sometimes overnight, without food, anything. They released us in the morning. But this went on like that. I was only arrested once like that. But this was going on, unfortunately. In other words, you were not safe anywhere anymore. Any gathering place, any public place, you were not safe. Or, for instance, you could walk on the street, and for no reason at all, they would stop you and ask for papers. And they didn't like anything about your papers. Come with me to the police station. Kept them there for a few hours, then released them. But this harassment went on. So your life started to be miserable from the day they marched into Hungary.
What was the food situation like?
The food situation was not worse than anybody else because there were shortages already. The armies took away, and the German army and the Hungarian army took away most of the food crop, and the men were no longer working the field, so there were shortages, as is for everybody, not just for us. But I don't remember to the point that it was starvation. There was bread, there was dairy products. I think there was plenty.
Meat?
Meat occasionally, yes, there was meat. I think for Pesach we had meat. I think that, yeah, Pesach we had meat. Remember that.
What was the Pesach like that year?
Pesach was a very sad Pesach. I'll tell you, we sat around the Seder and were crying. Mainly because we had our Polish guests there. Okay, we had invited them for Seder. And maybe they were not talking so much, but they were constant reminders to us. Constant reminders. We knew that the end is coming. It was I hate to call this the Last Supper, so this was the last Seder. We knew that. It's the last time we sit together at the table. Because in the beginning of April, there was already talk about the ghetto. And as I said before, we were notified by the Jewish agency, by the Judenrat, that I think the word is the proper word, Jewish agency, because it turned out that later on that they were members of the Jewish agency, these people who worked for the Judenrat. Anyway, that ghettos will be formed and that not to resist and all that. So we knew that this is the last, and as I said before, I personally buried a lot of the stuff, so we knew that we're not going to be here long. So Pesach was just barely finished, and day or 2 days after Pesach, indeed, they gathered up the Jews in Satmar to go into a ghetto.
And what was that like?
Well, first of all, remember that we all belonged to a Satmar shul. The Yom Tov was sad because there were no more people from abroad. There's no more of this life that I mentioned before. So the whole Pesach was a very sad situation. Now, when after Pesach came, we finished our hiding of valuables and stuff, which this day I don't know where they are. I never went back to look for it. And I don't know how valuable they really are. I mean, we thought at the time they were valuable, silver and all that stuff. What did Jews have? Silver and more silver. And books, of course. We had some valuable books. Anyway, we finished doing that, and at that time I was already prepared with the all you need is a birth certificate to be considered as a Christian. You didn't have any pictures those days, identical. So I had a birth certificate of this boy, Donnie.
How did that come about?
Well, that came about because my mother's partner, under whose name we had the business, because Jews not being able to have a license, gave us her son's papers, gave it to us. And so I took his papers. I was ready with that.
Did you approach them, or?
I think my mother, I think there was arranged by my mother, yeah.
Did you know the boy?
I think I saw him once. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I knew the boy. They lived sort of far away from. They were in a peasant class. They lived outside the city, sort of.
Where?
Satumare is called the Big Satmar. Satumare means big, and it consisted of two cities, Satmar and Nemati. Other side of the river is another community, and that's why they call it the Big Satmar. Satumare means the big, the greater Satmar. Anyway, they lived in that community there, so I never had a chance to go to see. I never knew where they lived. However, let me say this while on the subject. Because they lived outside of Satmar, this woman offered us to let us build a bunker in her house. There was a man in Satmar who made, like in every situation, there's always somebody who's going to rise to the situation and make a buck out of it. He was specializing in making bunkers. He hand dug them. There was no machinery. This had to be done inside a house in the basement, so he couldn't bring any machinery. It was done by hand. And he had a way of doing some kind of trap doors that you couldn't see and all that. And anyways, we had a chance. She offered us to hide us in her house underground in the bunker. Now, the danger of that was that if you found out, not only are the Jews killed immediately on the spot, but the women, the Christians who were hiding them, were also arrested, and eventually I think they got killed. So the danger was tremendous. So, yet nevertheless, we had this offer. So here was my mother, a woman alone, without a husband, having a dilemma, what to do. Take a chance, go in a bunker, and if caught, immediate, instant death, or believe the pamphlets or the notices from the government, from the Judenrat, that nothing will happen, just cooperate. Now, here's a mother with 7 children. She has to watch out for her children. She has to take the lesser risk, obviously. I, being only 14, didn't have enough influence on her. I was in favor of going to the bunker to hide, only because the influence of these Polish boys. And I did not prevail. She did not go to the bunker. But I decided on my own that I'm not going to go to the ghetto. I'm going to run away.
What about your older sister?
My older sister was offered the same opportunity because that woman had an older girl, happened to be the same age. But my sister was very attached to the children. Well, my mother was in Budapest, away from the house. It's my older sister who managed the house. So she was practically like a mother to her little sisters. She was only 2 years older, she was only 16.
What was her name?
Handy. And so she was very attached to her children, to her sisters, and my mother, of course, and she would not leave them. She would not leave. I begged her, come. She happened to be good-looking, blonde hair, so she could easily pass for a Christian person. But she would not. In any event, I just wanted to tell you how easy it was to escape. It was so easy. They had no manpower. The Germans didn't do anything, by the way. They just gave the orders. The Hungarian able-bodied men were in the army. They had a couple of police who had to police the city. So who did they take? They took some old First World War veterans with some old rifles, a little wagon with a horse, and go to the Jewish neighborhoods and collect their luggage. You know, you're allowed to take 2 luggage or something like that. And the Jews had to march behind that wagon. And so they went, an old man. And I heard that tomorrow they'll be coming for us. It was a Friday. And that morning, about 11 o'clock, I saw that wagon there in the back, there far away, a block away. I said, I'm going to go. This is the time. I couldn't take any suitcase or anything like that because that would be suspicious. So I just took some small bundle, and the last thing my mother gave me was, she gave me a diamond, that if I'm in trouble, I have to sell it, I'll have something to help myself. So a little money in my pocket, very little, and a diamond. And I went, kissed her goodbye, and I went. I forget that scene. Anyways, as I look back, I see this wagon approaching closer and closer. And there was no police, there was nothing. It was just this old man. He was his horse was old and he was old. They were both walking slowly. Anyway, and I was a step ahead. It was 11 o'clock. The first thing I did, I ran to a barber shop and cut my pants off. I made myself a nice hairdo, you know. And I had prepared myself a jacket and a hat that the Hungarian youth movement had. It was a Nazi movement, actually. It was in preparation for the army, sort of a youth movement called Levante. And I bought myself a cap like this. I was tall for my age, so I looked okay, and I put that on right away. And the train was going to Budapest. That was my intention, was to buy a ticket to go to Budapest. there was only one train at night. So from 11, 12 o'clock till midnight, I was just wandering around the city. And I was able to observe how they collected the Jews. Terrible. I mean, there was no manpower. There was nothing. Anybody could have just gone about. But people went like sheep. They said, come. They put the suitcase and they went.
Did anybody object?
Anybody object?
That you
No, no. Anyways, so finally I took the train late at night.
Before we move on to that,
Yeah,
when you left your mother,
yeah.
can you describe that a little more for us? What that was like? Did you get a chance to say goodbye?
Well, yes, I had a small chance because the wagon was already getting closer to our house. I don't want to be trapped. So there wasn't much time. The last minute she asked me not to go. She was very much against it. Very much against it, yeah. She was very much against it. And what will happen to us will happen to everybody. Let me interject another story here, okay? Now, it's something that I don't like to tell, but I will tell it for posterity. I was a great admirer of the Satmar Rebbe, and so was everybody else. In those days, a Rebbe was everything. He was not just the religious leader, but he was also your advisor. If you had to make a big business, or you had to do a shidduch, or you had to make a big decision in life, you went to ask the Rebbe. My mother believed in the Rebbe. So when this dilemma came about, as I mentioned before, whether to go to hide or to go to the ghetto, she went to ask the Rebbe. And the Rebbe said to her, I wasn't there, but this is what the mother told me, that what will happen to all the Jews in Satmar will happen to you. Don't run. What will happen? You're not alone. You're not alone. It's a whole community here. Don't run. Now, there was a certain afternoon. That night, the Satmar Rebbe, his wife, and his secretary, his gabbai, had an ambulance, 2 in the morning, taking him to Cluj. Cluj is the city which is close to the border of Romania. I mean, it's right on the border of Romania. And took him there. Supposedly the plan was to escape to Romania that same night. He would give my mother advice, what will happen to everybody will happen to you. Now, he's a great man, a great saint, but that I'll never forget. Because I was arguing with my mother about hiding, and she wouldn't listen, but she had confirmation from the Rebbe. The Rebbe said so. Okay, the Rebbe knows it all. But the same night, he himself went with an ambulance. Now, not many people had the means to get ambulances like this, to buy off an ambulance. Remember, the ambulances in those days were all mostly government owned and operated, especially in wartime, and no one had wounded and all that. It was a dangerous scheme, very dangerous. But they managed to get through with that. Of course, it didn't work out, and I'll come to that later, another story, what happened to them. But this was the days before my leaving, what went on in this debate, what to do and what not to do.
What was his full name, by the way? The Rebbe's?
The Rebbe? Joel Teilbaum, Yoel Teilbaum.
And his wife?
His wife, Fagi. She's still alive. She's still alive. She lives in Monroe. Fagi Teilbaum.
And his secretary?
Secretary. Now here's another very, very curious situation. I hate to say this because it's spilling the beans, but it's something that I got to get off my chest. The Rebbe had a secretary, the father of this man. His name was Ashkenazi. This man was a very devoted man in his 60s. But this man had a son called Yosef Ashkenazi. He was younger, he was in his mid-30s. They left him, and so they left the old man, the father, instead of taking him with his ambulance, and took the young man, his son, made him gabbai as of he wasn't his gabbai before, as of that date. And this Ashkenazi, this young man, had a family of 7, wife of 6 or 7, a big family, wife and 6, and left them all behind. and went with the Rebbe to save himself. Okay, just an aside, since you asked me.
How did the community react to the Rebbe?
That was not known to anyone. That was not known. I mean, this was done at night. Now, this was done a day or two before I ran away, so I cannot tell you how the community reacted because I wasn't there anymore. I suppose there was resentment in the ghetto, once Jews heard about it later on, I suppose.
How did you manage to hear?
What happened? I didn't know. Nobody knew. I knew that later, and I'll come to that later, how I found out. I mean, I personally had a chance to find out, personally, but because I was involved in this, what happened later. But our paths met, okay? I finally met up with a certain letter. But, no, we didn't know. At the time, we didn't know.
When you saw your mother that morning, did you think you'd see her again?
I know we cried. I don't know. I don't know what our thoughts were, but I personally, she had hopes, of course, but I personally thought that these Polish Jews, refugees, knew what they were talking about. Yeah, I was very sad. I told you before, I was there all day wandering around, I had no place to go, before I took the train. I was crying all day. So, yeah, of course, I was a young boy leaving home, just thrown out of the world. It was very tough. At night, the train, of course, in those days, the air raids and all that, trains were not lit up. They were all dark at night. There was no light. So I was sitting in a corner crying all night. But of course, they have raids, constant raids. I mean, the trains, the police would come constantly checking papers. In fact, I was sitting with a bunch of Germans there, the same train. And my heart was pumping like this because, showing the paper. The first time I had to test the validity of my identity, whether it's really good or not, whether the papers work or not. I didn't believe the papers. The other problem was that my Hungarian was not so great, not so good. It was good, but not very. I mean, I couldn't imitate a Scheigitz, okay? You know what a Scheigitz is. A non-Jewish boy was called a Scheigitz. Okay, I wasn't that good. So I was afraid of going to ask me questions, and perhaps through my accent, something would come out, they'll start suspicious. But no, it went out all right. Looked at the papers, this young boy. My age had a lot to do with it, the fact that I was young. Had I been a few years older, would it be, because I was tall for my age, had I been just a few years older, I would be suspect of being an army, a deserter or somebody who's, what are you doing here? I mean, no young man was just traveling around like this. I would have been probably in trouble. So my age had a lot to do with it, so it didn't bother me much. So I went through that night till I found myself in Budapest.
Before you left, did you wait outside to see your mother and the kids?
No. I just had to leave. There was no time to wait. There was a hurried departure.
Then what happened?
Well, when I got to Budapest, I had an address I had an aunt in Budapest who lived in Budapest. My mother's sister lived in Budapest.
What was her name?
Her name was Babat. Her married name was Babat. And they have children. They have one child alive today.
What was her first name?
Rachel.
Had you ever been to Budapest before?
No. Never been to Budapest, never been to a big city. I was awed. When I arrived in the morning to Budapest, I was lost. I had no idea where I'm going, where I am, where to go.
When is this?
This was on a Shabbos morning, Friday night. I was leaving Satman on a Shabbos morning. What date exactly, I don't know, but sometimes in April. It was after Pesach, sometimes in April.
How did that feel that it was Shabbos?
Well, I'll tell you, I cried all night. And part of the reason was that also, that such a sudden change and all that. But I guess the instinct of survival was there with me all along. I wanted to live. Anyways, I arrived to Budapest. I had this address to go to, but it was dangerous because they lived in a Jewish neighborhood, and I had my Hungarian youth uniform. Okay, it was called Levente. Levente. That was the name of it. Anyway, and so, and I know they would be shocked. They didn't know I was coming. They didn't know. I mean, there was no telephone those days, call them ahead and all these things. And I, in my stupid young mind, I found myself to that address. Okay.
What was the city like?
The city was still okay. I mean, there was Budapest. For some reasons, there was freedom of movement. First of all, it was a big city. It was very hard. They couldn't do all these checking, controlling, and raiding as they did in the small towns. Secondly, they couldn't. Secondly, the city, they had plans for Budapest. They wanted to get, the Germans had a systematic plan whereby they'll get first the provinces and then trap the Jews in Budapest. So at first, Budapest was quite free in a sense, okay, in a certain sense. So Jews were still going about their business, although they had the war stars already. Of course, I forgot to mention this. The first thing the Germans did when they came into Hungary, they immediately, the day after, that every Jew had to have a yellow star. Okay.
Where did you get them from?
I don't know where I got them. I think I distributed them. I don't remember where I got them from, but everybody had to get, you had to sort them on with the jacket. And you couldn't leave, and it was a crime punishable by death or something terrible if you left. Anyways, I came to this address. Okay. At this address, this was again one of those courtyard type of housing, you know, where everybody was Jewish there. And I came in without a star, and of course with my uniform. I took off my uniform, my hat, and my jacket, and I came into them, and they were shocked. First of all, they didn't know who I was. But I was shocked at something else. When I arrived, my aunt was no longer there. What happened? She, as a mother, ran after the children on the street. They were playing, and she forgot to put on her coat, her star. And the police spotted her, and they took her away. And to this day, they don't know what happened to her. Never saw her. Anyway, I arrived to this uncle of mine. He had 3 children, 4 little, without a mother, in a cramped little apartment. I have to tell you, it was terrible. And this happened just before, just a week before. There was sadness, there was the man didn't know how to handle the children. Anyway, I came there just to say hello. They gave me some food. I remember it was Shabbos, they gave me cholent. Anyways, but food was also rare in Budapest. Also, it was not plentiful anymore. But you can still get it. But it wasn't just. And so I went the first night. I slept in some cheap hotel. I didn't have enough money to stay in that hotel. So first thing I did, I bought a newspaper and looked for a room to rent.
We're at the end of tape 3. Survivors of the Shoah, tape 4, interview with Jack Gross, November 9th, 1997. What were the names of your uncle?
I don't remember his first name. His name is Babat. He was a Rav in Budapest. He was one of the many that born in Budapest. Has many. One of them, and he eventually survived the war. He survived the war, but his wife did not.
And the children?
The children, of the 3 children, 1 of them survived. The 2 others did not.
Do you recall their names?
No. I only recall the one who survived, of course. His name is Yitzhak Babat. He lives in London, England today. He's a successful businessman. He married an English woman, and therefore that's why he lives in London. He actually came to America first. And he has children, all married and very and doing fine. His sisters, he had two younger sisters, were were running away, were smuggled into Slovakia. Slovakia is a part of Czechoslovakia. It's the one that's closest to the Hungarian border. Because for some reason, unbeknown to anyone, Slovakia was even later in the Germans' program of deportation. So they still believe that people will be saved there. So they took him across to a guide, and they were caught. And of course, we don't know what happened after that. We have to assume the worst. So the father and this little boy, the one who survived, actually came into the Kastner group, which I will explain a little later. Through privileges, through connections, his father was able to put him into the Kastner group. But he himself stayed on in Budapest, the father did, and survived in Budapest.
So you came to the house.
So I came to the house, and I saw right away that there's not a chance for either help or even staying. There was no question about that, but I just came that I should have some point of contact so I know somebody in that city in case I get lost. But I managed in the sense that I didn't have to come too often there because it was dangerous to go there. First of all, it was a Jewish neighborhood, and the house itself was a Jewish house. And everybody there was wearing stars, and I wasn't, so this would have been super suspicious. They had a system, the Germans also had a system of informers, that the janitor of the building was usually a Christian, and he was reporting the comings and goings. And if you would see people coming without a star, he would say, something unusual, he might report it. So I stayed away from that place, unfortunately. So anyway, I got myself a newspaper and looked for a place to sleep. Housing in those days, in wartime, of course, was impossible. So the best I could accomplish was to get a bed, just to rent a bed somewhere. And sure enough, I found a working class, a workers family. Where they lived in one big room. The husband and wife lived in one room. And the room was big enough, they put a curtain down, and they had cots, about 10 cots. And they rented cots like this overnight. That's what I rented.
How did you find out about it?
It's in a newspaper. And so I had a place to sleep. That's the first requirement. Had a little money on me, so I was eating whatever I could. Restaurants here, there, everywhere. I didn't keep kashrut anymore. That was it. Religion was finished at that time. There was nothing. Not only the religion finished, but I didn't have anything to do with Jews. I didn't want to be close to Jewish neighborhoods. Budapest had Jewish neighborhoods. Unless I wandered into these neighborhoods, but not knowing the city, I wandered into by mistake, and I got right out of it.
Was that gradual?
That was gradual, yeah. And so that was that. Then I needed something to do for two reasons. A, to have some money, because I didn't have enough money to stay myself. And secondly, to be somewhere, not to wander the streets. That was dangerous in those days. Anywhere you went, you were always being stopped by the police for papers all the time. Wartime Hungary. I was lucky in that respect too. I found an opening, again through the newspapers. They're looking for a messenger boy. Messenger, fine. Who knows how to ride a bicycle? I applied. They took me right away. First job I applied for. The pay was nothing, but enough to live on, to pay my bed and some meals. And it happened to be in a neighborhood, in a very nice neighborhood, where it was right close to the German headquarters. In fact, my job required that I go to a building. The headquarters was in a hotel, one of the old established hotels there at the Danube River. And they took over the hotel, but they still left some floors for some old ladies who still had some old apartments there, rent or stay there. And my job was to deliver some. By the way, that was an orthopedic store. They made inlays for shoes and girdles and all these orthopedic equipment, health equipment. And so my job was to deliver these things, and I had to go into the German headquarters with my cap, that was my pass. And I was so scared, of course, I was scared. the wrong move, the wrong something, you know, I'm right there, trapped in there, right in the midst. But anyway, I managed, and as far as bicycle riding, I was a very poor bicycle rider because in Satmar we didn't have many bicycles. We had some, I knew a little bit, but not enough. So I got myself out of that one by claiming that traffic is terrible and that you can get killed. So I took subways, and not subways and streetcars. And before long, and I give it, I'm really surprised at myself that I knew the city. I knew Budapest very well. To be a messenger, you got to know the city. You got to know where you're going. And I learned it pretty fast. And I can also give myself credit to one other trait that I have is I learn languages very fast. And I picked up the nuance, the accent. The Budapest people, the big city people, talk a little different than the provinces, finer, more refined. And I picked it up very fast. And so I worked among, it was a big place, the factory, many people, and they didn't, I got along fine. I was Donnie, I was great. They liked me there.
What was it called?
The place, I don't remember anymore. I don't remember anymore. But I know it was on the address, I remember, and they bombed that place, by the way. When I went there to look for it, it was Shash Utsa 60, number 60. They bombed that place later on because it was close to the German head. Remember I told you it was close to the Danube River. It was really in the center of everything. I mean, the nicest place you can imagine. So anyways, so I made do. Okay, I made do. However, we had lots of time on our hand. I had lots of time on my hand. You know, evening, Saturday, Sunday, what do you do? There was a 6 day. No, Saturday I worked, half a day. I got my pay on Saturday.
Was that hard at first to work on Shabbos?
I'll tell you the truth, it wasn't hard at all. It wasn't. I must be honest, you know, and in spite of the fact that I came from a very religious background, I was very angry. I was angry at God. I was angry at everything that's happening to us, you know. Yeah, I was an angry young man, an angry boy, okay, and I didn't care. And I wasn't alone, and I'll tell you what happened, I found out later I wasn't alone in the city, so how do we make contact? As I said, I had lots of time on my hands. So where does a man, you don't go to the room because you had no room, you only had a cot there. Okay, so I went to the park. It was still spring, okay, it was nice, May, June, July, it was summer. And we hanged out in the park. As we sit in the park, all of a sudden I see other boys sitting around staring in space. And they had, apparently this was a group that was already existed before I came to Budapest, that a bunch of boys and girls who lived there as Christians. And they had a password called Amchu. Amchu. It's all that to say Amchu. And if you answered, you know you were a Jew. So one year I sit there and I say, Amchu, Amchu. Okay? Who else can say Amchu? Only a Jew can say that. So I made contact with another boy. And he was telling me, and he was contacted with other boys, so he was already part of a group. And he was telling what really goes on. I didn't know what goes on in the Jewish world. That he was telling me that, first of all, they deported most of the Jews from the provinces. They're gone. And they know where they went. They went east. East means only Auschwitz. And they knew also Auschwitz means death. It doesn't mean anything else. So at that time, I found out that my mother and sister probably were already gone by that time. That was in May, June, more like June.
Did you hear the word Auschwitz?
Yes. Well, Auschwitz I knew from the boys, I told you, from those Polish boys. They told us all about it. They told us everything. So it was no surprise what I heard. I mean, it was no surprise about the places. But once you heard that they're going east, see, because remember I said they were told they were going to a Hungarian farm and all that? Well, that was west. Going east means the opposite direction. So right away we found out it was the rules, the whole thing. But these boys had already contacts. See, these boys, it wasn't organized, but semi-organized. They had some contacts. And they were telling me also another fact of life, that the Hungarian police is aware that there's a lot of boys running away from the ghettos, living under assumed names. And what they do is simply take off their pants and see their circumcised. That's all. In those days, Christians did not circumcise, unlike today in America. And that was their simplest way of finding out. And once you found out, that was the end, finished, no questions asked. So it's not safe anymore. You had to do something. So, and then through this boy, introduced me to other boys we met in restaurants, also through, okay.
Know any of the names?
No, I don't know any of the names. In fact, they didn't want to know names. I don't think we knew names of each other. We didn't want to know names. In case one gets arrested, shouldn't tell about the other who knows their name. In fact, I'm glad that you mentioned it, because I remember that was one of our system, no names. That's all you need to know. Anyway, so these boys, they all said, we got to do something. It's not going to last long. In fact, they were telling stories of one that they knew was arrested yesterday, all kinds of stories, horrible stories. So they organized to escape to Romania. There was an underground chain link. Budapest is far from the border of Romania, but you have to go down to the provinces, hundreds of kilometers away, before you get to the Romanian border. Romania at that time left the alliance. Romania was allied with Hitler, but the Romanian king realized in the middle of 1944 which way the wind was blowing. And he jumped out of the alliance and turned towards Russia. And therefore they stopped in fact, they didn't deport any of the Jews, very few in fact. They stopped deporting Jews, they stopped bothering Jews altogether. So it was a safe haven for Hungarians to run to Romania. And they were successful. I mean, you see, the Hungarian border, Romania and Hungary was, there's no mountains, there's no rivers, it's all open, it's all farmland, it's all flatland, most of it's flatland. So it's very easy to come across a farmer who happens to be straddling a border or something. And they found these farmers who did it for money. Of course, it's very dangerous. You were caught, you were shot on the spot. But nevertheless, they succeeded. There's quite a few of them did it. And how we know we did it? Because all of a sudden, we didn't see them in the park. So we assumed he's gone. And slowly, the number dwindled. I didn't have enough money for doing that. You had to have money. So I was thinking of selling my diamond. My mother gave me. And that was my plan. But I was chicken, to be honest with you. It was because I was doing pretty well for myself. I had this good job, but they liked me there, and this rooming house was okay. It was all right. I couldn't take a shower or a bath. They had to go to a public bath. There was nothing like that, but okay. And I sort of liked my freedom, and I said, I endanger myself, go to a border and all that. So I didn't do it. I didn't do what others did. At the same time, these boys told us that there is a group that is being taken to Palestine through didn't know the name, Kastner like that, through the Jewish Judenrat, where they are buying off the Germans to allow 1,200 people to go to Palestine. And the plan was that they'll be taken through Germany, going through Germany, and from there to Spain. And Spain was also allied. It was all the Axis powers at the time. And to take a boat to go to Palestine. Yeah, but this is just a talk. Naturally, this was reserved only to the big shots, to the elite. How can a boy like us, how can we get in there? No way. But it was talk. How we dreamed about maybe we can get into this group, how nice it would be if we could get into this group. And that was that. So one Friday afternoon, I came back from work, and as I said to you before, that place was in a very central location, a very good location, where I go by a hotel, which looked to me like a hotel, and a policeman stands there, and people and Jews are coming and going. I said, what the hell is this? What is this? I go closer and I ask. Of course, I was a Hungarian boy. I could talk to a policeman. I could ask questions. So he tells me that these are the Jews that are going to Palestine, and this is where they gather them together from Budapest, from the city, and this is the gathering point. And from there, they're going to take a train tonight. In fact, they're taking a train to go west. And I watch and I see how things go, and I see people come and go. Nobody, this policeman doesn't ask questions, names, nothing. I said to myself, let me take off this hat, put it in my pocket, and walk in, see what happens. I walk in, and I asked the Jew there, in fact, I know his name was Frank. Frank. He was from a big family in Budapest, a renowned family, Frank family. And I asked her, what's the control here? He says, I don't know. He says, hey, you want to stay? I says, can I? Well, try it. Stay. And I stayed. He says to me, but hey, remember, you got to have another name. You're not Donnie now. You got to have a Jewish name. So for some silly reason, I took a name, Schwartz. My name is Gross. I thought Schwartz is really Jewish. That's really Jewish. So I took a name, Schwartz. You call yourself Schwartz from now on. Okay. I was Schwartz. I don't remember even my first name, what it was, but it was Schwartz.
When was this?
That was on a Friday afternoon, August 1st or 2nd, the beginning of August. Okay? Now, I had no suitcase. All my stuff was there in that room. Even my diamond was there, hidden in that suitcase. I had nothing. I just had what I had on. Nothing. So I stayed. I stayed. And sure enough, at night, 11, 12 o'clock, they herded us into trucks, buses, trucks, whatever. Took us to a railroad station, off the main road, a main station that is, in a freight yard where there was a train, a freight train, it wasn't a passenger, a freight train. And they took us, they put us into trains like this. I don't know who I was with, I had no idea. Now, remember, these people came from homes, packed with food, drinks, clothing, everything. I had nothing. I was hungry. I was hungry at night. I had nothing to eat. I was coming from work. I was starved. And I'm going to tell you the story. It's really not interesting, but you know, these things seem funny to me in retrospect. And I was hungry. So there was a man there, and everybody was lying down on the floor. They were sleeping, you know, everybody was sleeping. But when I'm hungry, I cannot sleep. You cannot sleep when you're hungry. So there was a bag. A man had some dates or figs or something there in the bag, and I grabbed the dates or figs from this bag at night when nobody was listening. The man, I guess, was not sleeping. He got up. He gave me a punch that I saw stars, you know. Anyway, so that was that. We traveled all night. Train was moving. Okay, travel all night.
What kind of a train?
It was a freight train. It was a freight train. Everybody was lying on the floor, you know, sitting, lying. But as I said before, they all had food with them. They were all prepared. They came from homes, not from ghettos. We travel and travel all night. Daylight came. All of a sudden, the train stops, and they said, "Everybody out! Everybody out!" The train was off the train was stopped in on a sideline, sort of off the main line, in an open field, and it stopped. Everybody out. Everybody out. As I walk, and everybody out, and then I start to see who the people are. I didn't see who, you know, because that place where I went in was only one gathering place. There was two other places. They only contained 300-400 people, so they had 1,200. It turned out later there was 1,700. It turned out later that I wasn't the only one who smuggled myself in. That from the 1,200 became 1,700. Okay, so I wasn't the only one so smart. But anyway, we all got out, and that's when I started to look. All of a sudden, I see the Satmar Rebbetzin walking with a can, looking for water. Why? The Rebbe had to wash his hand, you know, water. Not for drinking, just to wash his hand. He was very medactic on this. Everything, he had to wash his hand. She was looking for water. And I see her. "What are you doing?" She said, "What are you doing here?" That's where I found out the story, what happened to them. If I may, I want to interject the story now. Okay, what happened was like this. When they left Satmar with the ambulance, the plan was that some 2 or 3 in the morning, some guide, some Romanian farmer would meet them in a certain street and go to the border, run across the border. But nobody showed up. They arrived there in the middle of the night, there was nobody there. They wandered around, the ambulance goes around, finally the police got suspicious, stopped the ambulance, saw the people, who's there, took the Rebbe and his entourage. Actually, entourage, only the Rebbetzin and the Gabbai, that's all that was there. There's two other people. And they took him out, and first they took him to the police station, questioned him, anyways, put him into the ghetto. At that time, Cluj was already, the ghetto was already in function. It was a huge brickyard. They took him into the ghetto. That was the end of that. Now, can I start with the Kastner story here? Okay. What happened, I mean, how did he get to this train altogether? How did he get back to here? When the Germans came to Budapest, they set aside the old Jewish leaders, and they appointed young men who were mostly from the Jewish agency, from the Zionist organization. They preferred dealing with them than with the old aristocrats and capitalists and whatnot. And amongst the Jewish, and there was this young man he came from Cluj, Romania, because that time was Hungary. Remember, that part was all Hungary. And besides, Cluj had a Hungarian population. They all spoke Hungarian very well. So this young man was educated in a Hungarian university. He had no job. He was a young lawyer. He had no job, but he worked for the Jewish agency as a clerk, an assistant, whatever he was doing there. Nothing important. He was good in German, and when they needed someone to talk to the Germans, he was the one they pushed up to talk. The Germans first of all demanded to see other leaders, not the old. So they got the Jewish agency people, which was a Zionist, controlled by the Zionists. The Jewish agency at that time was the semi-official government of Israel. I mean, they're not the government. They looked after the interests of the Jewish community in Palestine, and they had offices throughout the world, throughout the Jewish world. Anyway, this man was the spokesman became the contact, the liaison between Eichmann, Adolf Eichmann, and the Jewish community. Adolf Eichmann was sent to Budapest at that time for the sole purpose to deport and get rid of all the Jews of Hungary. He had tremendous experience from previous countries. He was the top man in their hierarchy on the Jewish question. His job was mainly logistics, transportation, execution, bless you, not the work itself. Okay, that was his strategy. Now, he needed, so they looked for people that they can work with, that will work with them in cooperating in getting the job done as quickly as possible, knowing that the war front is getting closer to Hungary and they don't have much time. So they demanded two things. One, there should be 100% cooperation from the Jews, and in return they will give them a small number of Jews that they will be taken away from Hungary. Now, this, of course, was not known to anyone at the time. All we knew at the time that Kastner was so great, he managed to save 1,200 Jews with money, for money. And these 1,200 Jews were his discretion, who he chose. So naturally, he went first to his hometown, Cluj. He comes from Cluj. He came from Cluj. He couldn't find a job there. So he came to the big city. Like all young men, they find a job in their own town, they go to the big city. Anyways, he was in Budapest at the time. And he selected, out of 1,200 people, 400 people from his town. Of course, the relatives and cousins, but even people who were at his wedding and his bar mitzvah, and anybody that he knew ever since, because to get 400 people, you gotta select, you gotta go and reach far to be able to put together 400 people that are friends. So people who were not related at all, but just that he knew once or did him a favor or whatever. So anyways, 400 people. While the Satmar Rebbe was in that ghetto, one of the men who were already leaders of Cluj was Dr. Fischer. He was the father-in-law of this Kastner. This Dr. Fischer befriended, I would say he had respect for the Satmar Rebbe, and asked his son-in-law, Kastner to include him among the 400 people. As I said before, to get 400, you got to reach far. So another man, so the Rebbe, and three people. That's how the Rebbe was taken out of the ghetto and taken with the group, with the 400 Cluj people, to Budapest, into one of these hostels, hotels. And that's how I found out that morning. And that place was called Magyar Ovar. It's a little village near the border with Austria. The story, now the reason they kept, so anyway, that's when I found out what happened, why the Satan Rebbe. So anyways, I went to see him, and very happy to see all that.
How did they sing?
Pardon?
How did they sing?
How did they what?
How did they sing to you?
Well, they seemed happy that they were, you know, in this group. This is supposed to be the savior. I mean, this was it. This is going to Palestine. Eretz Yisrael. This is the best thing ever happened. He was at that time no longer dressed in this regular garb. He had a regular hat, you know, hat, and he had, in order to hide his beard, he constantly wore a scarf around his beard, okay, like he has a toothache, or somebody has a toothache, so he had his beard like this, and he had a regular jacket with boots, pants, you know, so he didn't look like a rabbi anymore. And Ashkenazi, of course, was also shaven already and no longer. Anyways, that's where we met. Now, the reason why we're there in this open field, it seems, well, we were not told, but we were told only that the railroad tracks were bombed and it couldn't continue. But apparently there was a hitch in the negotiations. Something did not come through. The negotiations revolved around, besides money being given in Budapest, that the Allies would give trucks to the Germans, a certain number of trucks. And this was not possible. I mean, the Allies would not do that. So this went back and forth. So they stopped us there for 3 days. We were in the open field. People who had food, no problem. I had no food. So I was going on my own to knock on farmers' doors. An open field. We were not even controlled. We could just walk away if we wanted. I went to farmers' doors. I had a few dollars, pengers, whatever, money, and I bought eggs and I bought some fruit. Anyway, that's how I sustained myself for 3 days. Then all of a sudden...
How did people react with each other?
People, well, you see, at that time, people had, when you react, were they hopeful or were they happy or what? Well, most people know each other. I mean, they were mostly either the contingency from Cluj, they certainly know each other, or the Budapest people. They also knew each other. I was the outsider, I didn't know anybody. Anyway, that group, being that it was a Jewish agency group that was in the leadership, meaning Zionist, also had a group of children, orphans. And that was my reason of being there. I mean, that's how I explain myself, how I'm there. This cousin of mine, Babat, the child from...
The end of